Hey, I apologize for running a little behind. And now this isn't going to work. I don't know why it's not going to work. Apparently it's decided it's not going to work. So what you get when you're running behind, you get all these little technical difficulties. Houston. There we go. Wasn't showing up for me. Okay, hopefully we're beyond all the technical difficulties and we can actually start talking about World War II, or continue talking about World War II at least. So, I don't know, you've probably heard the FDR speech. It's one of the first presidential speeches from the Capitol building that was actually recorded. And if I don't say so myself, I do a pretty good FDR impersonation. So, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Now, to say it came as a complete shock would not be the whole story. The United States and Japan had been at odds for decades. First of all, just after the turn of the century, both nations were competing for political and economic influence throughout the Pacific. Then, after World War I, Japan laid claim to former German colonies in the East, expanding the Japanese empire and emerging as a serious rival to America's position in Asia. In 1922, the world's 9 largest naval powers, including Japan and the United States, signed a series of treaties limiting warship capacity, agreeing to consult each other in any disputes over China, and respecting the territorial integrity of China. But certain classes of ships weren't restricted by the 9-power treaty, leading to an arms race until the loopholes were closed. Then in 1931, Japan blatantly violated these agreements by invading Manchuria, which is a province of northern China, and other parts of China. So with the 9-power treaty now broken, America increased its naval power in the Pacific, and several nations began funneling aid to China through their colonies in Asia. Continued Japanese aggression for the next decade, including the invasion of China in 1937, their alliance with the Axis powers of World War II, and the invasion of French Indochina resulted in escalating American involvement without a declaration of war. Concerned American pilots formed an independent air force called the Flying Tigers and worked with the Chinese government to prepare defenses over that nation's airspace. The US government also joined its allies in seizing Japanese assets and placed embargoes on steel, oil, and other raw materials needed for war production. Running short on supplies because of this embargo and the extent they had to reach out from their islands. And remember, Japan is only a collection of islands, so they're very limited on natural resources anyway, which is one of the reasons they wanted to expand their empire. They only had 2 choices: submit to foreign demands by abandoning the invasion of China, or seize the resources if needed by attacking even more territory, and they chose the latter. So with the European powers already embroiled in World War II, it looked like the only thing standing in Japan's way of controlling the entire Pacific Rim was the United States, the only country that really wasn't focusing on the European front because they weren't involved in the war yet. So the Empire of Japan devised an elaborate plan to simultaneously attack Allied territories throughout the Pacific, including Hawaii, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Malaya, Thailand, Hong Kong, and Midway. In one sweep, they could secure desperately needed resources, discourage foreign interference, and cripple America's increasing military strength in the Pacific, because the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet was in Hawaii, and the Pacific Fleet was docked there at the moment. So to Pearl Harbor alone, Japan sent 30 ships, including 5 aircraft carriers. There was a separate force of submarines tasked with sinking any American ships that might escape the harbor. The top secret Japanese fleet set sail on November 26, 1941, and by avoiding shipping lanes, moved into position without being spotted. Now, my father-in-law is a huge World War II history buff, and he would actually argue, and not a fan of FDR's, by the way, he would actually argue, and there is some evidence to suggest this, that the United States knew about Japanese intentions, but let them do it in order to give a cause to them joining the war. They wanted to get the war. American public was against it, and this would give the American public a reason to support joining the war now. So although the Allies had not yet broken the Japanese naval encryption code, there were suggestions of an impending attack. Beginning as early as January 1941 and periodically throughout the year, Washington sent warnings to fleet and field commanders in Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska, and the Panama Canal Zone. But a lot of American decision makers believed that Japan did not have the military capacity to pull off a major strike. The day after the Japanese fleet embarked, a message went out to all Pacific stations reading, "Consider this dispatch a war warning." So many expected an attack on the Philippines to be most likely. However, minimal steps were taken in Hawaii proper. It's too far away. So most importantly, the aircraft carriers were all sent out, and in a fatal miscalculation, the Army commander lined up his planes as protection against sabotage. So in other words, in the hangars in the dark, it's a lot easier to get in there and sneak in there and maybe mess with the planes and be a saboteur. And the Hawaiian Islands did have a lot of Japanese expatriates living on them. So he had put them all outside in the daylight where everybody could see what was going on if anybody was around them. So in order to achieve complete surprise, Japan violated international law and diplomatic protocol by attacking without first sending an ultimatum. Still, in the wee hours of December 7th, 1941, there were at least 3 clues of imminent danger. First, an American patrol spotted a submarine periscope as it followed a cargo ship through the anti-submarine nets into Pearl Harbor. A nearby destroyer, the USS Ward, fired at the mini-sub and sank it. Second, a radar operator noticed the incoming Japanese Air Force, but officers were expecting planes from California that morning and dismissed the sighting as, oh, he must have just saw those California planes. Third, Washington forwarded credible intelligence of an attack, but it didn't reach the commander at Pearl Harbor until hours later. So shortly before 8 o'clock a.m. on December 7th, 1941, 181 Japanese planes arrived over the island of Oahu, targeting the military airfields first before the U.S. planes could get off the ground to defend the harbor. Hundreds of aircraft lined up in a row were just sitting ducks. They were damaged and destroyed. Next, the Japanese unleashed their fury against Battleship Row, hitting all 7 ships at anchor there and sinking several of them, including the USS Arizona, which, if you get a chance to go to Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, is now a monument there. It still lies at the bottom of the bay. As the first wave of planes departed, the leader of the Japanese strike force sent back the prearranged message, "Tora, Tora, Tora," to the carriers, meaning the element of surprise had been achieved. After a brief lull in the attack, 170 more Japanese planes arrived in a second wave, targeting another battleship and 3 destroyers in dry dock and inflicting further damage on the battered fleet in the harbor. And before 10 o'clock in the morning, 3 out of 8 battleships were lost. The bomb that pierced the USS Arizona ignited the ship's ammunition, causing an explosion that killed nearly 1,200 men. Total 12 ships were sunk or beached, and 9 more were damaged, including 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. 347 aircraft were hit. A total of 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians in Honolulu, and another 1,178 were wounded. It took several months for the U.S. to bounce back from the losses at Pearl Harbor and other locations. And that opened a window of opportunity for the Japanese military to advance throughout the Pacific very widely and quickly in early 1942. As bad as it all sounds, believe it or not, it could have been much worse. The shoreside facilities were still operational. The aircraft carriers were all away from the harbor on a training maneuver, And most of the destroyers and submarines were not targeted, and all but 3 of the ships that were struck that day were raised or repaired and back in service by 1943. So while the Japanese attack hurt the Navy, it didn't destroy it. The Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was the last straw, though. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress broadcast live to the entire nation via radio, asking them to declare war on December 8th, 1941. There was only one dissenter, a Montana pacifist, Jeanette Rankin, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the United States of America was at war. On September 1st, 1939, the world witnessed what came to be called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, when German troops blazed across the border of Poland with a dense concentration of armored infantry and heavy air support. After years of appeasement, Great Britain and France finally declared war on Germany, and World War II began on September 3rd, 1939. Germany's invasion of Poland was carried out in cooperation with the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler, the Nazi chancellor of Germany, pretty much hated communists, but for a time he put aside his animosity towards Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to make sure the Soviets wouldn't interfere with his plans and he'd have to fight a 2-front war. Germany invaded the western part of Poland while the Soviet Union moved into the east. Almost immediately, a naval campaign was underway as each side fought to help the other from receiving crucial supply shipments, and the Battle of the Atlantic lasted the duration of the war. The United States responded to all this, and this is before Pearl Harbor, so they were not direct combatants in the war, by passing the cash and carry policy. And that allowed for the sale of arms to belligerent nations if they could pay up front and transport them in their own ships. And through a series of neutrality acts had expressly forbidden most types of economic, military, or commercial investments in the war, cash and carry allowed America to remain officially neutral, keep its ships out of danger from German U-boat attacks, and avoid the credit problems that shrouded World War I, and yet still provide help to Britain. And this is one of several steps that moved the U.S. toward war because it was pretty clear Britain was our favored client. Ultimately, World War II lasted nearly 6 years and spanned several continents with 2 main theaters, Europe and the Pacific, each with multiple battlefronts. It was fought between the Axis powers led by Germany and Japan and the Allies led by Great Britain, France, and the United States later. Italy was part of the Axis powers at the outset of the war, and the Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany, but both of these nations eventually joined the Allies. Each side also had the support of many smaller nations, and this provides an overview of major engagements in the European theater, including the Western, Eastern, and African fronts from the outside of the war through 1943. Within 1 month in 1940, the Nazi war machine overran Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And next, they had their sights set on France. It took just 6 weeks to storm into Paris. France surrendered to Nazi Germany on June 22, 1940, on board the very same railroad car, placed in the very same spot with the very same people in their very same places where Germany had surrendered to France at the end of World War I. And it was a moment of sweet revenge for Hitler and thousands of other bitter German veterans of the Great War. Meanwhile, Britain hastily evacuated more than 338,000 mostly English troops from French territory. And there's a great movie about that called Dunkirk that came out a couple of years ago. They used every craft available. If you owned a dinghy with a motor on it for fishing, you were going across the channel with every other personally owned boat, picking up as many people as your ship could hold and bringing them back. So a collection of 700 vessels ranging from Royal Navy destroyers to private yachts, lifeboats, and fishing boats did this remarkable feat. The so-called Miracle of Dunkirk saved the core of the British Expeditionary Force, but they had faced stiff resistance and many men, boats, and planes were lost. Worse yet, about 35,000 primarily French troops were left behind, and all of the BEF's heavy equipment, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel fell into German hands. The French had already signaled a surrender before Dunkirk, and so the British also found themselves fighting the French army as well as Germans at this point. So a few days after France signed an armistice with Germany, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who replaced